Out of work, Jeff had time to think about what he liked and didn't like about his former job. He liked the science. He was genuinely pumped about the possibilities of technological innovation. He didn't like sitting in a cubicle communing with machines instead of people. With this awareness earned by way of his previous mistake, he rebounded onto a new trajectory. He applied to law school and has since become a patent attorney. He uses his science background. He works closely with people in the service of innovation. It's a perfect synthesis for him, but to get there, he had to a clear and honest analysis of where he'd gone wrong in the first place. And what about the other brother, the one who seemed to be blundering from engineering school to the restaurant business and out again? He also found his synthesis by way of things that hadn't quite worked out. The engineering curriculum didn't really satisfy his creative independent side. His foray into the food industry showed him that he didn't have the temperament to be a chef. Working in restaurant kitchens, though, he found himself thinking like an engineer. He saw each kitchen as a kind of factory, each appliance and tool as a cog in a production process. How could the factory be made to work most efficiently? How could time and energy be saved? How could safety be improved? How could kitchen staff the best protected against burned fingers and sore backs? Then came to realize that his false starts and meanderings had given him a fairly rare and useful skill set. He could make schematic drawings. He understood the science of heat and of materials. He knew firsthand how heavy commercial saucepans were how crucial the spacing of a kitchen line. He became an industrial designer specializing in commercial kitchens. He had blundered his way to exactly where he was meant to be. But okay, if I'm talking about mistakes, it seems only fair that I fess up to a few of my own. Fortunately, I have plenty to choose from. I'll first with the I'll start with a mistake that is really a classic, by which I mean that lots of other people made the same error before me. I'd heard I'd heard of other people making this mistake. I'd seen other people make this mistake. For that matter, variations on this same repeated on a global scale would later come pretty close to wrecking the world financial system. But in the actual event, it didn't seem to matter what I had seen or what I thought I knew. I made the mistake anyway. This points out something fundamental about many of our goofs. We might think we understood how they happen, that we are savvy about where the pitfalls lie, but we don't really understand mistakes. But we don't really understand mistakes until we've made them for ourselves. Benjamin Franklin famously observed, experience keeps a dear school, but a fool learns in no other. If that's true, and who am I to disagree with Ben Franklin? Then all of us are fools. That's why even the wisest and best invention advice is simply that advice, and not some foolproof preventive medicine. Be that as it may, the mistake I want to examine here is my classic big house blunder. This brings me back to the late 1980s. I was cruises along in my business of writing music for commercials, finally making a pretty good living. I'd gotten married, and along With my wife at the time came beautiful twin girls. So there I was a seasonable, successful composer, as well as a husband, as well as a husband and father. It seemed like a logical time to become a homeowner as well. The opportunity presented itself for me to buy the house we were living in San Francisco, and I went for it. So far, so good. I could afford that house without too much of a stretch. Its scale was appropriate for the needs of my family. The next move was the one that got me into trouble. Hoping to expand my musical horizons, I'd signed signed I'd signed on with a record label called Narada, based in Milwaukee. Milwaukee. This association would enable me to market and distribute my own CDs. It would also expand my producing work, as other artists on the label would be encouraged to record in my studio. Finally, the arrangement carried with it the Wagyu, spiffy sounding job title of ex, executive execute ex, executive producer. The opportunity coupled with my Midwest roots, which still ran pretty deep, uh, per, perso, per, uh, persuaded me to pull up stakes and move to Milwaukee. The first order of business, though, was to sell the San Francisco house. Here I got lucky, or so it seemed at the time. The Bay Area was experiencing one of its uh, cyclical booms in housing prices, and I was able to sell relatively quickly, painlessly, and at a considerable profit. If this was good news, it was also a snare. It launched it launched me me on a series of small errors that eventually coalesced into a big mistake. Error number one. Since my very first foray into the buying and selling of houses and been a triumph. I thought, well, that was easy. Error number two. Since it's part of human nature to imagine we've been smart when in fact we've just been fortunate, I allowed myself the vanity of thinking maybe I have a feel for this real estate stuff. The errors continued at the Milwaukee end of the transaction. Compared with the Bay Area metro, Milwaukee seemed incredibly affordable, and I thought, why not make a really big investment? Big investment now and cash in when Wisconsin prices boom, just like they had in San Francisco. In retrospect, I was sort of setting up shop as a one-man real estate bubble. I thought prices could only go up. I thought that aggressive, if not reckless investments in houses couldn't possibly lose. So I bought a really big house right on Lake Michigan. It was probably 5 times the size of our place in San Francisco. It had space for a grad studio and extra rooms to put up visiting artists. It was way out of my price range, or what my price range should have been. Upkeep was enormous and unending. But what the heck? The property would certainly appreciate, and in the meantime, my career was clearly on the upswing, right? But again, this seemingly rotational line of thought was riddled with misjudgment. Why didn't I realize that my business would experience a hiccup or two with the move? Writing for commercials was still my bread and butter, and as I've mentioned, that put me in a service industry. I had to work harder and travel more often to service clients I'd had in San Francisco. Some of them inevitably drifted away. Regarding my fancy in-home studio, the idea was that other Narada artists would want to record there, and thus defraying costs. But what if they didn't? And what about this executive producer stuff? I'd like it the sound of it, but faced with the reality, I was reminded that I was a freelancer at heart. I didn't like sitting at a desk dealing with other people's issues. I didn't like having other people to answer to. Bottom line, I found myself way over my head with house house payments. I was saddled with more work related stress and I had ever felt before, and I was getting to do less, not more of what I really wanted to do. Why had I done this to myself? How had it happened? The answer I believe has application to the how to the house and whys of many of the big mistakes that people make. Basically, I think I made my big house blunder because I confused reasons with justifications. At each step of the way, I could marshal arguments for why buying a really big house made sense. I had made money on the San Francisco sale. Milwaukee was a relative bargain, and so on. But none of those arguments was before the fact reason to buy a big house. Rather they were after the fact justifications for doing what I felt like doing because the simple facts were these. I really wanted to move back to the Midwest to the Midwest. I fell in love with a beautiful piece of property, and and at the stage of my life, I just plain wanted a big house. Why was this important to me? The reasons are complicated and murky, and largely hidden from me even now. Probably they were quite ordinary reasons. Perhaps misguidedly, I saw owning a big house as a passage to full adulthood. Perhaps misguidedly, again, I needed a visible token of my professional progress. Whatever my precise motivation, the significant thing I think was this: I kidded myself that I was being entirely rational when in fact I was being driven by wants and pressures quite removed from rationality, and that's how a lot of big mistakes happen. Was my big house mistake naive? Yes. Was it avoidable? Maybe. Am I embarrassed about it years later? Absolutely not. This brings me back full circle to the set of ideas that opened this chapter. Mistakes are inevitably, so we may as well accept them, forgive ourselves, and move on. Our errors may cause us inconvenience, might cost us time and money, but assuming they are honest errors, they are not shameful. Every blunder is a learning opportunity, a marker on the winding road of where we've been, where we are, and where we think we're headed. If out of fear of being left behind, or of making some misstep from which we won't recover, we deny ourselves the slack to make mistakes. Then we deprive ourselves of those opportunities to learn. Worse, when we do make mistakes but refuse to admit them out of stubbornness or insecurity or inattention, we miss the chance to bounce off the error and head in some better direction. We miss the chance to become better at being who we are. Here is yet another of those paradoxes that I seem to run into whenever I try to express in simple words something true and basic about life. We are and are not the same people we were yesterday. And this is, of course, a continuity in who we are. That's how we recognize our faces in the mirror every morning. How we recall the kinds of things that make us laugh, how we maintain loyalty and steady affection in our relationships. But but it's equally true that we are always changing, developing, evolving. Each day we know a little more about the world and a little more about our own minds and hearts. The mistakes we have made and the course corrections that resulted from those blunders are an essential part of our evolution. So if we hope to feel good about the people we are now, we needed to regard with candor and acceptance the people we were then when we made those dumb mistakes. So, for example, when I think back to my big house error, I acknowledge that my decision making was faulty, and that my spasm of desire for a fancy home was straying from my truer values. I don't disown the blunder, but I look at it almost as if the folly had been committed by a different person, a younger friend, rather than rather than feel embarrassed about my naivete. Then I can take satisfaction in the things I've learned and the ground I've covered since. Not that I pretend to have outgrown or outrun my capacity to make mistakes. I still make my share of blunders, and some of them at some point in the future will no doubt seem as much of a head scratcher as the big house mistake seems to me today. I know that I'll have many more occasions to look back and say to myself, uh, Pete, Pete, what were you thinking? Uh, thinking. Confronting that question can sometimes be a little galling, galling, little galling. But trying to answer it truthfully is always a worthwhile exercise. 9. Be careful, be careful what you wish for. Because you just might get it. This Chinese proverb, in my view, holds an extraordinary kernel of wisdom that cuts straight to the core of human nature, and therefore seems to apply to all cultures and in all times. Consider the Greek legend, Greek legend of King Midas, obsessed with gold. Midas wished for more and more of it. In fact, he wished to be able to turn everything to gold. And this rash and dangerous wish was granted in the form of the famous Midas touch. For a brief time, the king was happy with his newfound power and boundless wealth, until he touched his beloved daughter, who was promptly changed from a loving human being into a lifeless golden statue. After all of these centuries, the Midas story still rings true and packs a punch. Why? Two reasons, I think. And the first is that it is a perfect illustration of the serious and sometimes tragic irony of life. A longed for gift becomes a terrible burden. The fulfillment of a fantasy turns into a disaster. But note, this cruel irony doesn't just happen to Midas. He brings it about himself. This is a story about human nature, not the wrath of the gods. Midas's irony comes from within, from a basic confusion between what he thinks will make him happy and what is truly important in his life. The second reason the Midas story still speaks to us across the centuries is that it remains a resonant if painful metaphor of one of the dangers facing wealthy parents. And what happens to the kids if the parents put the pursuit of money above all else? Are they in some figurative sense turned into golden statue? This is a question will return to in due course. For now, however, let's consider some other instances of wishes being granted, and of the unforeseen consequences that ensued. I know a man who had a long and mostly happy career as an editor of a glossy national magazine. He started as an assistant, answering phones and making coffee while learning the rudiments of the business. Then over the course of 20 years, he moved up through the ranks. His rise was not flashy or meteoric, but slow and steady, based on growing expertise and a network of colleagues who were in turn rising to more senior positions. At length, he was promoted to executive editor, the number two spot on the masthead. This as it happened was the perfect job for him. Executive editor, he had this discretion to choose writers and assign stories. He also had time to do the hands-on editing, shaping articles and making them better. Those were things he was really good at. Equally, or maybe even more important, those were things he liked doing. As for the job of editor in chief, that called for a somewhat different temperament and entailed a different set of tasks. The editor in chief was responsible for budgets and had to deal with the corporate politics of the parent company. He was the public face of the magazine and had to spend a lot of time entertaining and making official appearances as most magazines. The editor in chief had little or no time left over to actually edit. I loved being number two. My acquaintance recalls. I loved being able to sit quietly, quietly in my office with a manuscript. I love it. I loved having that layer of insulation between me and the sweets. But then the editor in chief decided to retire, and the formerly formerly contented number two started wishing for the top job. Why? Why? The promotion carried a substantial raise. This fellow says, but it wasn't really about the money. It was more about ego. I wanted finally to see my name in bigger type at the top of the masthead. And it was also about how I'd feel if I didn't get the job. I'd feel humiliated, and if I was passed over, it would be a public embarrassment, or public within the industry at least. All of those feelings are understandable, I guess. Unfortunately, though, they have almost nothing to do with the day-to-day reality of being editor in chief of a magazine. So my acquaintance was putting himself in the perverse but entirely human position of wishing for something that in the fact